Hello there. Welcome to this live event, a panel conversation here in Best for Britain headquarters, not in fact my rather well-appointed living room, where we are going to have a conversation about the UK Trade and Business Commission, 1 year on from the end of the transition period that saw Britain fully out of the European Union. I'm going to be asking all of them about the effects of that change on you, me, industry and trade in the British economy across the entire UK, and to run that conversation, to hold that conversation for people eminently well placed to talk about our place in a new and different trading environment. We begin with the Chief Executive Officer, CEO of Best for Britain, who played a crucial role in setting up the UK Trade and Business Commission, and she is, of course, Naomi Smith.
Good morning.
Next to her is the former Shadow Foreign Secretary, former Chair of the Brexit Select Committee, Labour MP Hilary Benn.
Hi, Jonathan.
And next to him, Tamara, Cincik, founder of the Fashion Roundtable, a trade body representing the fashion and clothing industry, and yourself, an exporter and trader. And finally, making up our panel, but virtually, is David Henig, a trade expert and advisor to the Commission in its work. So I thought what would be an opening shot from all of you in a minute is really just to tell us about your relationship to the UK Trade and Business Commission and why you wanted to be involved. I mean, I suppose with you, Naomi, you had not much alternative.
Well, yes, Jonathan, we'd done some work at Best for Britain in 2020 with some non-David Henig trade experts, people that had actually negotiated a lot of free trade agreements for the Australian government, because you might remember that having been in the EU, the UK hadn't really been off negotiating its own trade agreements. They hadn't done it for 40 years or so. So we commissioned them to look at what a fit for the 21st century modern trading relationship should look like. And one of the things that came very strongly from their research was you must engage business every step of the way, and that governments around the world that are doing best practice trade negotiations have their trading partner on one phone, their business industrialists on the other end, and they're saying, could you live with this if I negotiate that? Yes, we can live, and that's how it was done. And they were very concerned that the British government really wasn't doing that. And we were hearing that our own big businesses and small businesses across the country just simply weren't being sufficiently consulted. So when the transition period ended and the decision was taken to close the scrutiny committee in Parliament that Hilary chaired, we realised that business had not only been frozen out from negotiations sufficiently before the TCA was signed, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, aka the Brexit deal, as most people refer to it, but that there was then no mechanism to scrutinise how it was going, nor how new trade agreements that were going to be signed were going to be, looked at, consulted on with business and Parliament. So I spoke to Hilary and said, what if we were to get together a group of parliamentarians from every party, including the DUP, including the Conservatives, making sure that we had that leave remain balance, and a group of industrialists covering all the main sectors of the economy, to take evidence, to hear from business, to give them that voice, and then come up with very forward-looking, solution-focused recommendations to improve the deal. And that's what we've been doing since April.
Excellent. And so, Hilary, Ben, you're obviously involved in the very first conversations, but why did you want to be involved?
Well, because Brexit isn't done. It's just beginning, really. And having spent over 4 years taking evidence, I think it's really important that the evidence speaks for itself. And that's why we've had a lot of sessions acting like a select committee. We meet every fortnight. We've had really good quality witnesses. And basically the question is, and how's it going for you? And we went to see a trade minister recently and talked about what we had found. The trouble is the implications of Brexit remain extremely contentious, and not everybody wants to hear the news about what is happening. But for me, the overriding purpose is to address this question, which it's difficult to do at the moment because Brexit politics hasn't gone away. We've left the European Union. What is a new relationship between the UK and a really big and important trading partner going to be? And in a rational world, that's what the EU and the UK would be talking about today, a different model, but one in which both sides can see the benefit in a closer economic relationship. But unfortunately, in the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we might come on to, is a really bad example of that. There's still an argument going on.
We are going to get into all of that sort of thing. But from your perspective, Tamara, Cincik, you're involved in the sort of discussions about it, but also on the front line, actually, as somebody who is exporting and is trading. Why did you want to be involved with this effort?
So for my sector, the fashion industry, it's the largest part of the creative industries. And before the pandemic, they were growing 11% year on year. They're a massive, massive industry for the UK. And there has been a systemic decision made from education through to the trade negotiations where they have been overlooked and undervalued, and I see it as my role to change that. So I was really, really glad to be asked to join, because I feel very vehemently, having met with civil servants before we officially left the EU, when I was explaining the intricacies of red tape, such as carnets, the question was, what's a carnet?
From a government official.
And having done millions of carnets, let me tell you, once you've done them, you don't want to go back to them. And the red tape that is hitting so many businesses, and the majority of these businesses in the UK are SMEs, is overwhelming. And I'm still hearing that news. It's a tsunami for them. Having come, and they're still in the middle of a pandemic, of course. So it's just an added problem that our EU partners are not facing in such great quantity.
And finally, David, you're joining us remotely, although it looks very much, the decor matches almost identically. But David, Henig, you're a trade expert. This is your field. You are on board as an advisor to the Commission. Again, why did you feel this was necessary?
I feel that we could do more to bring the realities of 21st century economy and trade across all sectors to public and government attention. I felt that you had a government that was mostly kind of talking in simple terms about kind of reducing tariffs on biscuits. Look, I've nothing against exporting businesses. My cousin works for a major biscuit exporter. But I felt, look, the UK economy is much broader than this. We need a really much more sophisticated understanding. We can do that. We can get people in who can actually amplify that. And if we can demonstrate the UK economy is much more complex than people think, if we can bring in all the different sectors, whether it's fashion or the arts or food and drink, whatever it is, bring them all together, we can paint that picture and we can get government to start engaging. And I think they are starting to engage, but it is a very slow process.
So you've heard opening words from all of our four panellists. I should have introduced myself at the top as well and said that my name is Jonathan Freedland. I write for The Guardian, a bit about some of these issues every now and again. So we're going to have the conversation, and we want you very much to take part as well. Some of you have sent questions in advance, and we'll come to those if we can. But you can also fire in questions as and when they strike you by going into the live chat that will be below the screen if you're watching on YouTube, but also follow us on channels on Twitter and on Facebook. There'll be an option there, and the questions will reach us here. So do that as the thought strikes you. So Naomi, let's just get this sort of out the way from the start, because this is the UK Trade and Business Commission, and it sounds almost like a sort of quasi-governmental organisation. On the other hand, it's Best for Britain, which is an advocacy organisation and makes no secret that it earlier advocated for staying in the European Union. So what do you say to those who say, well, hang on, this is not a really neutral commission, open-mindedly hearing all the evidence, it's a bunch of Remainers?
Well, as an organisation that promotes evidence-based judgment, I think the evidence speaks for itself. Our very first concern was to make sure that we didn't just have people advocating Remain sat as commissioners. Some of our commissioners were Brexiters and still are. They just don't necessarily think the Brexit we've got is the one that was ordered, or they're people that believe that we just have room for major improvement. And then also from our witnesses, we had our first session trying to understand the sort of economic landscape. What is the bigger macro picture? And, we had Julian Jessup there, renowned leave proponent economist. So I think the evidence speaks for itself. We've been very careful to avoid any of that. And Best for Britain itself, yes, it was a temporary campaign against Brexit, but over the last couple of years, it has become a permanent organisation advocating internationalism. And we just want Britain to be a trusted trusted ally. We want it to be able to forge great new trade agreements, but that is difficult when you're reneging on the ones that you've already signed.
And just on the mechanics of how this works, as people watching this might want to know and to take sort of observe this as it goes on. These are hearings that are open. I mean, people can watch them in the way they're watching us now live on the internet. Exactly.
We've always been keen to stream them across multiple channels. So when an evidence session happens, it goes live on our Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. People can watch online and comment in real time as they can now. So we then also save those videos. Anyone can go back and watch the full back catalogue of them. But almost most importantly is very soon after each session, we get together as a commission and decide what are the key recommendations that our witnesses have told us need to happen to improve their ability to create wealth, keep jobs in the UK, keep exporting. And then we put those recommendations into government and we hope government listens. Sometimes they do.
Well, perfect question to you, Hilary, because the intention, we heard, was to make it balanced and not involve 9 political parties, etc. Your colleagues, first of all, in Parliament, do they buy that and think, yeah, this is a fair-minded commission with all views represented? But when you're knocking on government's door and saying, look, this is what we've heard in our commission hearings, what responses are you getting?
Well, we were well received by the minister when he agreed to meet us. But I think, look, let's be honest here. I mean, Brexit was about identity and sovereignty, and not so much about economics. And this is an inversion of the normal approach, normal, insofar as anything is normal in this age, that governments would take, where a really important question for government is, what is the economic impact of this going to be? Now, it's quite clear what the economic impact of Brexit is going to be. Look what the Office for Budget Responsibility said recently, a 4% hit to GDP, double that of COVID. And when people say, well, this is bound to be good for the country, evidence that suggests it's not quite as good isn't always terribly well received. I mean, just to be honest about this, but it will take time to unfold, frankly. You do hear some voices now saying, as Naomi just put it, this isn't quite what we ordered. So it's a very unusual time for the country. And I think you see that reflected in the trade negotiations, Australia and New Zealand, where my view would be the government has been really, really keen to get a deal and has been slightly less concerned about the nature of that deal, so they could wave a bit of paper and say, look, with our newfound sovereignty, our newfound freedom.
Does that mean the last thing they want is you turning up on their doorstep saying, well, actually, it's not really working out?
Well, if you believe in the benefits of Brexit to the economy as an article of faith, then challenging that faith isn't necessarily well received, and you just have to be absolutely honest about that. But that's why, going back to the point that Naomi made, evidence is at the heart of this, because let the businesses, the people, the sectors affected speak for themselves about what it means for them, the small businesses that are now drenched in red tape, bureaucracy and form filling that they never had before. And this, of course, is the first trade deal in British history where we've come out of it with worse terms of trade with our biggest trading partners. That's the truth.
I notice you're nodding, Tamara. You're going to be one of those people who is swamped. You called it before a tsunami of red tape. This is setting the bar very high here, but have you yet seen a direct impact of the Commission where a new regulation or a difficulty that you've encountered has been raised by the Commission with government and somebody's taken action? Or are we not at that stage yet?
We're not at that stage yet, unfortunately, because there's a myriad of issues that actually are in the UK government's gift that aren't about going to see the EU's in the EU officials in Brussels, and they haven't chosen to take those either. So I think there's a message around jobs for UK workers, but there's not an addressing of the fact that one of the people who gave evidence to us cited that there's 1.3 people per vacancy. So there's a massive skills shortage, and they haven't teed up the skills shortage and the job vacancies in enough speed. And I think having had 4 years before we officially left, they had enough time to sort this out.
And I think even where the government has noticed that there are a shortage of occupation and made tweaks to immigration rules as a consequence, they found that actually EU workers have not applied a sufficient number to take up those vacancies.
This touches on something I wanted to raise with you, David, which is, at one point this seemed as if it could potentially appear like quite a rarefied debate of interest to employers and politicians, but ordinary people wouldn't have an immediate feel for it. The shortages that people have endured this last period, do you think that's rammed home to people, brought home to people, how important actually the business of trade and trade agreements and negotiations actually are for regular, ordinary British men and women?
Well, trade is very much the hidden wiring. One wouldn't expect most people to take a great interest in trade, but I think that all the events really over the last few years and leading up to the shortages, yes, they have raised the focus of trade in the UK, and I think that the Commission speaks to what I hope is the sort of a broad middle ground in the UK that is relatively pro-trade, pro-business, pro-UK, wants to reconcile sovereignty, but a sensible sovereignty, with having availability of goods, with actually talking to trade partners, not just sort of yelling at them through the pages of newspapers or whatever, and making things better. Now, as Tamara suggests, I'm not sure the government's in that place yet, where it can move out of its view of kind of this is an antagonistic relationship with left, sovereignty first and nothing else really. But I think that for most people, we do see the shortages. I do get quite a number of comments from people about the fact that you can see in the supermarkets there's often now something missing, and this was a predicted outcome. Now, modern trade is complex. I don't expect people to fully understand where and how that's all happening, but I think that it is reflected as well in the polling figures that most people think Brexit is not going well. What is it? Only 10% of people think that Brexit is going well. We're hearing those stories as well, but as yet, yes, we need the government to be paying attention. But what we do is we continue to amplify those stories to find the people, find the UK exporters, and I think people can respond. I think all MPs know that there are always businesses in every MP's constituency that seek to export, and it's a great source of pride for an area. So, I think we do hook into ordinary people's lives in that way, that we want to support UK exporters.
On the point of impact and government listening to us, just a couple of points. So, firstly, I think they're listening. We've had David Frost comment in the Telegraph about our work. As Hilary mentions, we've had meetings with ministers, so that's incredibly positive. And things move quite slowly, within those kinds of conversations. So we wouldn't have expected them to have made a big implementation just yet. But also, if we weren't doing this, there would be no inconvenient truths for them. Nobody else was doing this work. After the select committee was closed, there just wasn't a forum for businesses to be able to come forward and have their voice in a public way. And so we've provided that. And while the government has yet to make any of the recommendations that we're calling for, and we hope that they will, we have had MPs coming to members of our commission saying, I've got a problem from a constituent, please can you help them? They're struggling to import pizza dough from Italy, was one of the examples, and that was to an MP who was a very vocal Brexiter. So I think the impact...
Take on the challenge?
Yes, and approached one of our MP commissioners for help, and we were able to give some signposting and guidance to that business. So I think we are providing a platform for more and more businesses to find their voice, to speak up and to start saying, hold on, this isn't quite working for us. And also we're beginning to have an impact with other parliamentarians, if not yet fully with the government.
Let's just talk about the business community. And I know it's a very broad category, but what you feel, Tamara, the mood is in business, not among necessarily people who are already really involved in the issue like you, but just whether or not there is business confidence, business optimism. It's been 11 months since the end of the transition period in 2021, but are people's expectations, hopes, fears for 2022, do you think?
So before On Friday, I sent an email out to a number of businesses, and the one thing that has been a consistent issue is the VAT retail export scheme, which has been removed by the UK government when we left the EU.
And just explain, probably a lot of you watching this will know what that is, but just explain for people who don't.
So the tourist spend in the UK before we left the EU, if they weren't from the EU, they could get their VAT back. And
So it made it attractive to them to spend here.
Yeah, and it's been perceived, I think, by government as this kind of la-di-da, only affects Westminster, which, by the way, is a Conservative constituency, and Bicester, which is in Oxford. But it doesn't, because it's affecting tourism, it's affecting trade. Charles de Gaulle has, before the pandemic, obviously, the numbers for the first year went up in terms of as a destination. So it not only affects those people working in those luxury brands and those big, it's big like the Kering and the LVMHs. It's actually the person working in the cafe. And I think when hospitality and tourism are on their knees as a consequence of the pandemic, surely you would want to support business and attraction. And it's about attraction. Any consumer does the numbers on if they're buying a piece of clothing that's worth, say, £300 and they're travelling across Europe, they will check the price on where they can buy it.
So that's just a small example of how that might dent business confidence, because this.
So that's what I'm hearing about consistently. Plus the red tape, people just are. I'm getting a lot of people saying I'm relocating. Farfetch, which is a massive fashion tech. It's one of the biggest, and we lead in fashion tech, is currently in Old Street, and it's moving to Porto in Portugal.
To be in the EU.
7,000 jobs.
Because they want to be in the European
Yes.
Union. I mean, David, Henig, just on this point about optimism, business confidence, I could imagine if we spoke to Tamara's colleagues in business, a lot of them would be similarly fearful about 2022, but that might be for a whole lot of other reasons to do with the pandemic and so on. How confident are you that actually some of the pessimism we're hearing and picking up is related to our exit from the EU?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that businesses, by and large, don't want to engage in politics. They want to actually do their business, and they also don't want to be fully fearful about the politics to come. They want to be, thinking about how they're going to expand their business. So we hear a lot of, from one side of the argument saying, "Oh, business are just, just whinging again." No, most of them are, they may be frustrated, but they really just want to get on with the job of doing business. And there are good signs in the world economy. It's growing, and there are more worrying signs such as inflation and supply chain strains. Although certainly in the case of the supply chain strains, I do expect those to ease over the next year. But some of them are down to the growing demand. So the frustration then, if you're in the UK, is that there is growing trade. 2021 has been a year of growing trade, but the UK doesn't appear to have benefited that much from it. And there is a concern that this is because the UK government hasn't really focused on this. Instead of what can government do to help UK business grow and expand, we get Peppa Pig and trade barriers. And that's ultimately going to be the problem, because governments around the world are trying to compete to attract inward investors, to attract people to establish their businesses, to make the best business environment possible, and to give them easy access to other markets. And in the UK government, we're not particularly trying to attract inward investment, and we cut off, put huge barriers up to our nearest market, and deals with Australia and New Zealand are not really going to do much to replace that. So whereas business in general will be thinking of still of ways, how can we expand our business, they are not being helped in any way by government, and they are very frustrated about that.
Just on the very specific of the company that Tamara mentioned that moved out of Old Street in London and have gone to
Moving, it's in the process.
Or in the process of transferring to Portugal. Is that a single anecdote, or are you picking up lots of examples like that?
There are plenty of companies who have moved operations to the EU. We heard from one earlier in the year that provides a small batches of chemicals to labs around the EU. It was a business model that simply wasn't sustainable operating from the UK. I've been approached by 2 or 3 businesses who asked me, in my opinion, could they move to Northern Ireland? Would that help them. We have a conversation about that. It is anecdote. We don't have very strong figures on on exact numbers, but these all add up to the disappointing trade figures we see with the EU. It all adds up to the forecast for declining growth that we see from the OBR.
In unpicking COVID from Brexit, we've got a very handy case study in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland just simply has not suffered the supply shortages that GB has.
Because it remains in the market for good.
Effectively, yes. So, that's the perfect case study when we want to look at unpicking it. Another report Best of Britain did in 2020 was looking with the Social Market Foundation, so a centre-right think tank. We did not want to do it with a think tank that was sort of perceived as being, a leftist Ramona outfit, about the double whammy impacts of COVID and Brexit. And it was very clear that manufacturing, financial services, the Northwest and the Midlands would be the hardest hit by the double whammy because of the disproportionate impact of Brexit rather than the pandemic on those regions.
Hilary, I noticed you were nodding through a lot of that.
I think, look, one of the consequences of this is businesses, they're very practical. They will deal with the challenges that are in front of them. Reconsidering supply chains, and the story that Tamara just told is a really good example of that. And that works kind of both ways, because companies have built a way of doing things on the back of membership of the European Union. And if there are now obstacles that make that difficult, they will reassess the way in which they work that.
Are they already doing that? Are you seeing adjustments made? And if you are, no name is nodding, but if you are, what kind of adjustments are they making?
Well, we've heard from businesses, as David said, who have indicated we're going to have to move some of our operations into Europe because it's not practical to carry on in this way. On the other side, look at the announcement of electric car battery manufacture in the Northeast. Now, it was crucial to get a deal that didn't involve tariffs, which is why no deal would have been a disaster. And you take a company like Nissan, they're remaining, which is great. But they realised, because of the rules of origin, another complication, if you're not making your electric car batteries in the UK and sticking them in the cars and selling them to Europe, it's just under 2,000 cars a day, then you wouldn't be able to do that tariff-free if you were importing the batteries, say, from Japan. So that's another example. And that is why there would be a great deal of worry if we end up in some kind of trade war over the Northern Ireland Protocol, because the EU has talked about, well, we might give you notice that we're going to suspend the TCA.
And I know back to tariffs if we...
And then you would be back to tariffs, or they may do it selectively. And it's very interesting that there's been leaked in the last day or so proposals that the EU is looking at more generally to give the Commission the power to put in place sanctions. It's really a mixture of trade and foreign policy, because I'm afraid this is, the world in which countries operate. But the Northern Ireland example is really interesting, because actually the protocol puts Northern Ireland in the best of both worlds. And if there was certainty about its continued existence, where would you... The protocol. Yes, the protocol. Yes. Where would you choose to invest to have access to both markets?
Well, we have to ask you, Tamara. Have you thought about it?
So ASOS have moved some of their jobs to Northern Ireland, and my understanding, and forgive me if I'm wrong, is they've always had their taxation through Dublin because there were favourable terms for creative industries. So 100% I have advised businesses to look at Northern Ireland.
You have. Go on.
And I think what we're seeing is from our evidence sessions from businesses, this really big difference between the multinational, large organisations that can adapt. They have access to huge advocacy and consultancy services internally. They've been able to flex, move jobs, etc. And the SMEs, who only had a £20 million SME Brexit support fund from the government, of which a month ago only 6 million or so had been dispersed to them because the barriers to accessing it were ridiculously high. So if you had ever once exported outside of the UK, you were ineligible. Sorry, outside of the EU, you were ineligible. So if you ever once had a customer in Zimbabwe or Sydney or something, you were ineligible for that. And those SMEs are either deciding not to export anymore, they're just going to focus domestically, and they have just absented themselves now from trade because of all of the red tape issues and cost issues, therefore, that Tamara has cited. And others like Fluorochem, which is the one that David mentioned, have decided to relocate out of the UK. And the Federation of Small Businesses has said that about, I think, a quarter of their members are just, not now exporting anymore because it's just too burdensome, not worth it.
And I think why that's Hilary. I think why that's important is that during the pandemic, so many businesses relied on the EU as their biggest trading operation, and were shifting to digital because bricks and mortar wasn't working. And obviously, all consumers of that escalation of the shift to digital has been escalated by the pandemic. As it's understandable, people don't want to go into bricks and mortar, or they don't feel safe, or the rules keep changing, and that, in a very fragile economic situation, provided surety for a lot of businesses, and the EU consumer was their biggest market. And then boom, they had really angry clients and customers going, I'm not paying £35 extra, sending it back, so being hit with all these tariffs. And they just felt swamped. I had one brand that had tried to get that £2,000, insulted, 90 minutes on the phone for £2,000. He just said, forget it. The guy on the phone doesn't understand what my business is. And they left it. And so there has been a disparity in support for SMEs compared to the fishing industry that got 32 million.
So Hilary and David both want to get in, and I'm glad to say people are coming in now with questions, and we're going to get to those straight away. As soon as we've just heard from Hilary and David on this, you can keep coming with your questions. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, there's the option of the live chat below, but also on Twitter or Facebook. We are following your questions, and I'm going to put them to our panel. Hilary,
I was just going to add that the irony of all of this is that the UK has not yet started full checks on EU goods coming into the UK. Now, originally, that's because we weren't ready. That's why they've been buying fields and creating checking centres in Kent. But I think it also goes back to the point that you raised earlier, Jonathan, about shortages. I think the government's been worried if we start doing checks on stuff coming in, if that adds to shortages, particularly in the run up to Christmas, then people will not be best pleased. So they're now due to come in partially in January and fully in July, unless they are delayed again, because they've been delayed, I think, twice now.
given the point you're making about the politics of it, you can imagine that being indefinitely delayed, because who's going to want the image of suddenly, lorry parks and people delayed? David, you wanted to come in, and then we'll come in with these questions.
I think it's an important thing to raise at this point is because we easily get asked, you're only talking about the EU, so why can't exporters just suddenly go and shift all their markets to Brazil or New Zealand? As if that's somehow really an easy thing to do, or business hadn't thought of it before. There is such a thing as a gravity model of trade. We trade more with the nearby countries because they're easier to trade with. Generally, we travel to them more, we understand them more, we have deeper links there. As soon as you put up these kind of barriers and you say, we'll go off and trade with New Zealand, well, first of all, you haven't been able to get to New Zealand because of travel restrictions for the last year. You don't have the connections. It's more expensive if you want to go and research the market. Or we already sell a lot to the US, so it's not as if you can easily just switch off the nearby market and just switch on markets sort of many thousands of miles further away. Businesses would love to do that, to sell more to further away markets, but it takes a lot of effort, and it's going to be even harder if you can't do that on top of existing market strength in Europe, in your nearest markets.
So always wondered how it squares with the government's commitment on the climate crisis and net zero to encourage people to travel 10, 12,000 miles. Let's just bring in some of these questions. The reason I've been looking at my phone, by the way, is not because I've been following David's copious Twitter feed, but actually because I've been looking at your questions, and this is how they're coming in. Linda has written in to ask about red tape and bureaucracy facing the music industry. Tamara, this could be a question for you, as somebody who is obviously in the creative industry. Linda asks, how should the government be looking to solve the post-Brexit challenges facing the music industry, and particularly touring performers? People have heard a lot about this, about performers who used to make their living doing gigs in continental Europe and now can't. After all, music is a hugely successful UK cultural export. How should the government address these issues of work permits and visas?
So I'm part of the Free Move Create campaign that was set up by ISM, the Incorporated Society of Musicians. And I would say it's wider than just music, it's all of the creative industries. The steering group from DCMS, which is looking at this issue, has 12 music organisations and 1 from the fashion industry. It's the same issues. I've worked as a stylist with musicians on their touring outfits. So I want it for all the creatives, the reduction of red tape. Most of these people are freelancers. They pay their taxes here. They're usually not earning loads of money. They could be really not earning very much because there's so many gaps. And you need to be able to get to market quickly and easily. And you also have a unique skill. And it might be whether you're an opera singer or you're a guitarist or you're a stylist or you're an actor. I would say it's equal. And the music industry have been very consolidated in getting that message across. And the last I heard from DCMS is that the EU didn't really understand what a stylist was. And I said, well, that's why I should be on the steering group, because I'd be able to explain it to you. So it's this, you're dealing with people who are economically challenged, who live here because they pay their taxes here or they're from here and they want to be here, but they have to travel. And they have to be able to travel quickly.
It sounds like just the sort of thing that government could fix relatively easy. It's a very specific problem.
Well, I agree. I mean, here, as Tamara's just said, great British success story. One of the jewels in the crown of our economy, and the government in this deal has stuffed it completely. And what's the answer? Well, the answer is to do a deal with the EU in which we say, can our musicians and theatre companies and stylists and technical experts come and do touring in Europe, and your folk can come and do touring here, and everybody benefits. And there's been, I'm afraid, a standoff between the EU and the UK about who offered what during the negotiations. But leave that on one side. The rational world that I long for, but I'm afraid we're not living in at the moment when it comes to the after effects of Brexit, that is what you would do because both parties would benefit. And it's one of the recommendations that we've made, and I hope we'll get to the point where it is possible for that to happen without all of these difficulties, because the way in which people tour, you get practical problems like lorries. Lorries come out with all of your stage equipment. You can only do, I think it's a couple of stops before the lorry can no longer travel around the rest of Europe. So if you're doing a 15-stop tour, you've got to move your gear into another lorry or get a lorry from Europe in the first place. I mean, these are the very practical questions we're talking about.
John from Macclesfield asked, are the government actually listening to the work you're doing? I mean, it flows a bit from what Hilary's just been saying. Naomi, do you think the government are actually, I know they're having the meetings with you, but are the words actually going in? Are they listening?
You'd have to ask them. We hope so. They are certainly open to us coming back and having more conversations with them. We are, confident that our work throughout 2022, because I'm sorry to tell you guys, but the Commission's work isn't done. We're going to have to rumble on, and we're going to find different ways of communicating that message, finding different ways of, rather than having witnesses come to us, we're going to get out of our bubble and go to them. We're hoping to go around the country, taking our commissioners to witness firsthand these complex supply chains, these issues. What does this red tape actually look like? How many forms does somebody have to fill in? How many hours does that take them?
Maybe actually going to the factory floor, as it were. Indeed,
maybe going to free ports, going to the border in Northern Ireland. So seeing firsthand, that real seeing is believing, and documenting it as we go, so that then rather than just having letters that we write to government, we will have video testimony. We will have, a documentary style way of saying, guys, this is the problem, and here are the solutions. We're not just moaning. We're not just calling out holes in your deal. We're proposing ways to improve it, improve British jobs, improve UK PLC.
Just again, very practically, Susan from Peterborough asks, how can I get my local MP involved in the Commission's work? And I think that, the kind of roadshow kind of visits you're talking about would be an obvious place. But just give an answer to Susan how practically she could do that.
Very easily. So if you're signed up to Best of Britain at bestofbritain.org/join, you will then be on our database and you will get emails that say, click here, put your postcode in, and there's the automatic email to your MP, letting them know all about it. That's the easiest way.
That's terrific. I want to pick up with something rather ominous that you mentioned, Hilary, which was the phrase trade war, and what that, heaven forbid we get into it, you say, but, if we did, it could be a return to those things that we had been trying to avoid with a no deal. So the question comes here is, given there's already been disruption to the UK-EU trading relationship, how much more damage could be done to the economy by a trade war with the EU? In other words, some people perhaps don't fear that quite as much as your comment earlier suggested they should.
Well, I think the biggest risk at the moment is around the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, you had to have a way of handling the fact that the one thing in this process everybody agreed on is you're not going to check goods as they move between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And you are either going to have a border in the Irish Sea, or the whole of the UK was going to remain in some kind of arrangement. And the Prime Minister decided to have a border in the Irish Sea, having promised that it would never happen. Anyway, it's perfectly possible, I think, in our view, for the negotiators to come to a satisfactory settlement. Because let's be frank here, there were bits of the EU at the start of the process who were saying, in respect of Northern Ireland, the rules are the rules and all the checks have to be done. But the Northern Ireland Protocol is built on this concept of goods at risk of entering Europe and goods that, by definition, are not at risk. And the proposals that Maros Sefcovic, the Commissioner, has now come forward with are a recognition of the fact you can't apply the checks in the same way to Northern Ireland. Take medicines for NHS patients. You can't have the EU saying you cannot have your cancer treatment as an NHS patient in Northern Ireland unless the drugs have been certified and approved in a particular way. It's nonsense. And the difficulty at the moment is over the role of the European Court of Justice. But the EU has been quite clear. If the UK government decides to, in effect, put the protocol on one side, then they've made it clear we've got a range of options that we could use to bring home to you the consequences of your actions. And there's a terrible lack of trust. That's the other thing. Because you had, in the last 2 months, the UK government saying to the French, you must honour the trade and cooperation agreement when it comes to fishing licences in Jersey. Well, on the other hand, saying, well, we might tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol and not honour it at all. Well, where's the trust in those circumstances? And that's where we have to get over this continuing Brexit politics, because I fear that the government thinks having a punch-up continuously with the EU, they think is good politically, but it's not good for the British economy, for stability, including the stability of the protocol, which, as we've already identified, what a wonderful position for Northern Ireland to be in, provided people believe that the protocol is going to be there for the long term.
This is the best of both worlds notion. David Henig, this is your field. This phrase trade war, it is often bandied around, but probably not that well understood. Just explain to people watching what a trade war, were it to come to that, would entail.
Yes, and the phrase trade war is not overly helpful because, I tend to think of it more as sort of trade conflict, where basically both sides are taking actions to inhibit trade with the other. So it may not be that they're fully stopping trade, but they are taking actions. They are maybe putting tariffs on your most sensitive goods, or they are carrying out extra inspections. They are restricting your services companies. Let me give an example. President Trump, who famously said that trade wars are good and easy to win, imposed 25% tariffs on Scotch whisky exports to the US in October 2019. Our exports of Scotch to the US in the year after he imposed those fell by £500 million. So that is the practical impact of a trade war in one product. Now, that was all about, for President Trump, having a trade war with the EU over steel and aluminium, and it really didn't, and also over Airbus and Boeing, which has been going on a long time, and none of it really works. So trade wars aren't easy to win, because ultimately you have to go back to the issue that started, the Northern Ireland Protocol issue, and resolve that. You are merely, in the meantime, imposing damage on businesses, and also damage on your political system, because those businesses are going to politicians and demanding to be exempted, or demanding that their rivals in the other in the other country are being punished. So it really is all about trying to find ways to inhibit business. Really not something we want to go through. Something that could cause us a great deal of damage, because if you are the smaller country in a trade war, the bigger country just has more tools they can deploy. If the EU says, actually, we're going to put penalty tariffs of 10% on UK cars, Nissan has a problem. And we know they already said they are not sure that business model works with tariffs. So Nissan is at risk if we have a trade war over the Northern Ireland Protocol. These are the sort of the bare facts of why we really shouldn't go there.
Naomi, just hearing that, it makes me wonder if groups like yours are wary of talking about this too much, because it does go to this idea of project fear. There you go again. You're always talking down the country or conjuring up these fears. Are you reluctant to go there, as David Henig says, even to warn people of something like a trade war, because it sounds as if we're, Remainers are again being negative?
And again, that's where we like to make sure that we are working as closely as possible with members of the Conservative Party that did vote to leave, but maybe desperately want to avoid a trade war, with members of the DUP. We have, a DUP member sat on our commission. We have been very careful to be as solution focused and forward looking as possible. And as a campaigner during the Remain campaign, during the referendum, and subsequently hoping for a second referendum, I couldn't be more cross with George Osborne for what he said about the emergency budget if we voted to leave the EU. That did so much damage because that was Project Fear. But what we're seeing is that most of the other cautions have actually become Project Here. Project Fear did translate into Project Here. And as Hilary mentioned earlier, the OBR now saying that Brexit will have a 4% hit to GDP in the longer term, far more than COVID. So we don't want to talk about it, but you also can't escape it when it is actually happening and it isn't a projection. And that's why we've been very, very keen to try and give more voice to business, so it is actually coming from them. I mean, they were relatively silent in the 2016 referendum in a way they weren't in the 70s, and they really led on the referendum about joining the EC then.
We have only about 5 minutes left. We're aiming to finish in around 5 minutes' time. But your questions have kept coming. And Alan Scott on Facebook has asked a question, which I think will be one for you, Tamara. He's asked about a question about red tape and bureaucracy facing small and mid-sized enterprises, SMEs. Alan Scott asks, how should the government address the unnecessary burden of increased post-Brexit red tape on small businesses? Obviously, we've touched on this all throughout our conversation, but what would be some of the specific asks you as a business leader might put to government, specifically with SMEs in mind?
They need to put back in place more support for businesses and actually people who come from business, so that the brand owner I spoke about, who spoke to a consultant from the whatever it's called, the Brexit Fund, knew what his industry meant, knew what his implications of these red tape were on his business. There needs to be more support. £2,000 just doesn't cut it. It's insulting, quite frankly.
Remind us what the £2,000 is.
They were offered £2,000 as SMEs as a support for them to go through all the paperwork.
As a kind of transition payment sort of thing. And that's just
it doesn't really, it's kind of like a kick in the teeth. If you're down 20,000 per month, on your business, and you're being given 2,000, and you're taking a 90-minute call, so there's got to be a hiring of people who come in to support businesses who actually understand the issues facing all these businesses. I think that would be number one. And number two, a reduction in all asks for red tape, and then going back to the EU, which is our largest trading partner. And the points that David cited about how you don't grow business by decimating the business that you've had with the people over the road, and then try to grow the business over there. And when you look at the numbers, there is not one trading bloc that has the numbers of the EU. You don't say, right, okay, we'll go for Australia and New Zealand. That's going to be really good for business, at the cost of cutting off our arm with France, Italy, Germany, all of the EU 27. So they are drowning under red tape. They are drowning under carnets. The costs of the VAT. Then if they've got people coming here, the VAT res. So all in all, it's just red tape after red tape. Now, we were told that we were leaving the EU to reduce red tape. That just has not been the case. So if that's what you want, then deliver that, because businesses are suffering and they can't afford consultants, they can't afford experts. And then when they're ringing the government experts, they don't understand their business. So all of that needs to be aligned. It's just not fair.
This is probably going to have to be closing remarks now from our three remaining panellists. But just to you, Hilary, Benn, you're the co-chair of the UK Trade and Business Commission. You're right involved in this. I wonder if there's just a limit on how much you can advocate, simply because the politics of this are such that for a generation, this must stand and Brexit has to be allowed to sort of go through. You can't make the kinds of arguments we've just heard from Tamara, that it makes no sense to cut yourself off from your nearest trading bloc. Even if you think that's true, you can't really say it politically because it's got to be allowed to run its course.
Well, Brexit has happened, and the question now is different. What kind of trading relationship are we going to have with our biggest, nearest and most important trading partners in the future? And that requires a change of mindset on the part of the government, but also on the part of the EU, because Brexit politics affects both. And at some point, we will arrive at a moment where we look at each other across the channel and say, this isn't terribly sensible. Can't we build a new and a closer relationship where we address some of these difficulties? And if you look at the deals the EU has done with other countries, what it offered Ukraine, look at what Norway's got. It's perfectly possible, in my view, with the right political will, to create a new model that addresses some of these, because in the end, it's not in the interests of either side. Because you wait till the checks come in on EU goods arriving, because you'll get complaints from EU businesses. It's not in anybody's interest to carry on with the kind of relationship we've got at the moment. So I'm an optimist, and I think we will get there eventually. How long it will take, well, that's a whole other question.
David, a closing thought from you on what that new model that Hilary, Benn has just described, what that new model should look like within the parameters he's set out, which is obviously a post-Brexit, not rejoining relationship, but a new model. What would it look like?
In the first instance, what UK businesses really want at the moment is stability and a government that responds. Get that, a stable relationship that we can build on. And then what the next stage of the model looks like is that where we have the problems like the touring artists or the companies who are, haven't going through too many checks, okay, well, what are the options to solve that? We can maybe have a standalone deal on the issue of touring visas, which covers a certain number of the issues around musicians, people in the fashion sector, and others. I think in the first instance, it looks like specific deals and fixes to specific issues that makes things stable and better. Relatively quickly. Thereafter, I'm sure that the politicians will talk about different models, and we can go back to that. But what we actually need in the first instance is not to be thinking about what the models are. We need to be thinking about how we can practically make a difference as quickly as possible, and that is going to be around niche issues and around listening to the issues that are brought to government's attention, and the government actually doing something about it in negotiations with the EU. I think that's clearly what we need to see.
Closing thought from you, Naomi Smith, on whether or not you're an optimist like Hilary Benn is, or whether you feel this is a government that isn't going to do what David Henig says and just be in listening mode.
Well, I'm an optimist when it comes to the British people, and I think they are going to start to flex their muscle more as their frustrations with shortages and the lack of reciprocity becomes much more obvious to them. Jonathan, you said something to me a few months ago that has really stuck with me about our immigration policy ending up looking like a Swiss cheese. Our government is aware that it needs to bend the immigration rules for fruit pickers, for HGV lorry drivers. Presumably, it will also have to do so for social social care workers and other industries too. And where is the reciprocity on the other side for young British people to be able to go and work as hairdressers in Marbella, or doing a ski season in the Alps, or learning to, study another language through the Erasmus scheme that's now being cut off to them somewhere else. So I think over time we're going to see the British people begin to say, hold on a second, there must be a better way of doing this. And I believe in them, and I think that they will put the pressure on the government to change then.
On that closing note, the work of the UK Trade and Business Commission does go on. You can follow it via the bestforbritain.org website, I think, and you can see some of those hearings live as they happen. Finally, just my thanks to our panelists, David Henig, Tamara Cincik, Hilary, Benn, and Naomi Smith, and thanks to all those who sent in questions. Sorry if we didn't get to yours, and thanks to you for watching. Goodbye.